The dust settled softly on her curves, accumulating in the fine cracks that spread like spider webs across her once lustrous maple body. Tucked away on the highest shelf in the darkest corner of Barlow's Pawn and Curiosities, the violin had remained untouched for nearly 7 years. The shop's fluorescent lights rarely reached her, but when they did, they revealed a once beautiful instrument now bearing the scars of neglect and mishandling. Mr. Barlow himself had forgotten about her, just another item that had been pawned and never reclaimed, too damaged to display with the more promising merchandise. The violin had no name, no known maker's mark that he could discern. Just another forgotten object with a forgotten history. Final week. Everything must go. The handwritten sign on the shop's front window fluttered in the late September breeze. After 36 years in business, Mr. Barlow was closing up shop, his arthritis making it impossible to continue. What didn't sell would be hauled away to the dump. Owen Phillips pushed open the door, a bell announcing his arrival. At 32, his once promising career as a cellist had dwindled to giving private lessons to disinterested children and occasional gigs with a wedding quartet. The circles under his eyes spoke of late nights working on compositions no one would ever hear. "Morning, Mr. Barlow," Owen called out, scanning the cluttered shelves for anything of interest. The closing sale meant prices were slashed, and though his bank account was nearly empty, he couldn't resist one final browse. "Back rooms open too," Barlow called out, not looking up from his newspaper. "Everything's 80% off. Take whatever you want, saves me the trouble of disposal." Owen nodded and made his way past glass cases of tarnished jewelry and shelves of dusty electronics. The back room was even more chaotic, boxes of unsorted items, furniture with torn upholstery, and racks of vintage clothing. He was about to leave when something caught his eye, a flash of amber visible on the top shelf, partially hidden behind a taxidermied owl. Curiosity piqued, Owen carefully moved the owl aside and found himself staring at the forgotten violin. Even in its damaged state, something about it called to him. Owen gently lifted it down, his fingers instinctively careful despite the instrument's obvious disrepair. The back was cracked in 3 places, the bridge was missing, and all 4 strings had long since snapped. The scroll, however, was intricately carved with a delicate pattern of leaves, and despite the grime, he could see the fine craftsmanship in the wood's grain. "How much for this?" Owen asked, returning to the front with the violin cradled in his arms. Barlow squinted at the instrument. "That old thing? Been here forever. $10 and it's yours." Owen hesitated. $10 was his lunch money for the week, and the violin would cost hundreds, if not thousands, to restore, money he didn't have. The rational part of his brain urged him to walk away. What use was a broken violin to a cellist anyway? But as he held it, he couldn't shake the feeling that this instrument had a story that deserved to be heard again. Something about its silent suffering mirrored his own, and in that moment, he made a decision that would change both their fates. "I'll take it," Owen said, pulling out his worn wallet. As Mr. Barlow wrapped the violin in newspaper, Owen felt a strange sense of purpose wash over him. Perhaps in saving this forgotten instrument, he might somehow find a way to save himself. The bell above Madeline Rossi's workshop door jingled softly as Owen stepped inside. The small space smelled of varnish, wood shavings, and history, a scent that immediately calmed his nerves. At 74, Madeline was considered the finest luthier in the city, with a 2-year waiting list for repairs. Owen had no appointment and little hope she would even consider his project. "I don't recognize you," Madeline said without looking up from the cello she was rehairing. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, magnifying glasses perched on her nose. "And I don't take walk-ins." "I know," Owen replied, clutching his newspaper-wrapped bundle. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I found something I think might be special." Something in his voice made Madeline pause. She set down her tools with a sigh and gestured toward her workbench. Let's see it then. With careful hands, Owen unwrapped the violin and placed it on her felt-covered workspace. The harsh overhead lights illuminated every crack, every imperfection. For a moment, he felt embarrassed. Who was he to waste this master craftsman's time with what might be nothing more than junk? Madeline's expression remained neutral as she picked up the violin, but her hands, those hands that had restored instruments played in symphony halls around the world, moved with reverence. She turned it over, examining the scroll, the F-holes, running her fingertips along the cracked back. "Where did you find this?" she asked finally, her voice hushed. "Barlow's pawn shop." It was about to be thrown away. Madeline removed her glasses, fixing Owen with an intense stare. "Do you have any idea what this is?" Owen shook his head. "Just that it called to me. I couldn't let it be destroyed. This," she said, carefully setting the violin down, "has all the hallmarks of an 18th-century Italian violin. These inlays on the scroll, the proportions of the body. It's extraordinary craftsmanship, despite its condition." She pointed to a barely visible pattern along the rim. "This is not the work of an amateur." Owen's heart raced. "Can it be saved?" Madeline didn't answer immediately. She took measurements, made notes, examined the interior with a small light. The restoration would be extensive. The cost. She looked up at Owen's worn jacket and scuffed shoes. "Significant." "I don't have much money," Owen admitted. "I lost my teaching position at Westridge Academy last month, budget cuts. But I can pay in installments, or maybe work for you. I'm a cellist, but I'm good with my hands." The old woman studied him for a long moment. "Why is this so important to you? There are playable violins you could purchase for less than the restoration costs." Owen struggled to articulate the feeling that had overcome him in the pawn shop. "Because something this beautiful deserves a second chance. Because sometimes the things that seem most broken still have value." He paused. "Because I understand what it means to be discarded." Something in Madeline's expression softened. "Come back tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. We'll begin then." Over the following weeks, Owen split his time between searching for new teaching opportunities and assisting Madeline. He learned to clean decades of grime from delicate wood, to mix hide glue to the proper consistency, to hold his breath as Madeline carefully pieced together the cracked back, reinforcing it from within. "The soul of a violin is in its voice," Madeline explained one afternoon as she showed Owen how to carve a new bridge. "Each has its own character, its own story to tell. This one has been silent too long." As the violin slowly transformed under Madeline's expert care, Owen found himself increasingly invested in its resurrection. He'd named her Elise, after his grandmother who had first introduced him to music. Sometimes, when Madeline stepped out, Owen would speak softly to the violin, telling her about his day, his struggles to find work, the compositions gathering dust in his apartment. "Found something interesting," Madeline announced one evening as they prepared to close the shop. She handed Owen a magnifying glass and pointed inside the violin, to a spot near the sound post. "Look there." Owen peered through the glass, squinting at what appeared to be tiny, faded lettering. He couldn't make out the words, but Madeline's excitement was palpable. "We might need to research this further," she said with a cryptic smile. "I suspect your pawn shop rescue might have quite the pedigree." As Owen wrapped his scarf around his neck and prepared to leave, Madeline handed him a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "An invitation," she replied. "The Riverside Cafe is looking for musicians for their weekend evenings. I took the liberty of recommending you." Owen stared at the envelope, a mixture of gratitude and anxiety washing over him. "But I haven't performed publicly in over a year." Madeline's eyes twinkled. "Then perhaps it's time for both you and Elise to remember your voices." The Riverside Cafe sat nestled between an antiquarian bookshop and a vintage record store, its warm golden lights spilling onto the cobblestone walkway outside. Despite its modest size, it had gained a reputation for showcasing exceptional musical talent in an intimate setting. Owen stood outside, his restored cello case in one hand and Elise in the other, his stomach tight with nerves. "You must be Owen," a voice called. A woman with wild curly hair and an apron tied around her waist greeted him at the door. "I'm Juniper, the owner. Madeline speaks very highly of you." "Thank you for the opportunity," Owen replied, trying to mask his uncertainty. It had been 14 months since he'd performed for anyone other than disinterested students or distracted wedding guests. The thought of playing his own compositions made his palms sweat. Juniper led him to a small corner stage adorned with nothing but a stool and a microphone. "We're not fancy, but we've got great acoustics and an audience that actually listens." She gestured to the gathering crowd. "They come for the music, not just the lattes." As Owen began to set up, he noticed how tenderly he handled Elise compared to his own cello. Though not fully complete, Madeline insisted some aspects of restoration couldn't be rushed. The violin had transformed remarkably. Her newly polished maple body glowed warmly under the lights, the carefully repaired cracks now beautiful battle scars rather than wounds. Owen had practiced with her for hours each night, amazed at her voice, deep and resonant, with an almost haunting quality that seemed to echo with memories. Though trained as a cellist, he found himself increasingly drawn to Elise, the notes flowing from her strings as if she were guiding his fingers rather than the other way around. Tonight, he would play both instruments, a challenge he'd never attempted in public. "Good evening," he said softly into the microphone, aware of the dozen or so faces turned expectantly toward him. "I'm Owen Phillips. I'll be sharing some original compositions with you tonight." He began with his cello, playing a piece he'd written years ago during happier times. His fingers found the familiar patterns, and he closed his eyes, allowing the music to wash over him. When the final note faded, the gentle applause brought him back to the present moment. Taking a deep breath, he set down the cello and lifted Elise. "This next piece is new," he explained, feeling strangely vulnerable. "It's called Silent Strings No More." As bow met string, something extraordinary happened. The violin's voice filled the cafe with a sound so pure, so expressive, that conversation ceased mid-sentence. Owen felt something unwind within his chest, a tightness he hadn't realized was there loosening with each measure. The melody, composed during late nights in his apartment as he imagined Elise's past, spoke of loneliness, of dust gathering in forgotten corners, of waiting for a touch that might never come. But as the piece progressed, it transformed, notes climbing higher, faster, brighter, the musical embodiment of resurrection. When he reached the final crescendo, Owen realized there were tears on his cheeks. He lowered the bow, embarrassed by his emotional display. The silence that followed lasted only seconds before the cafe erupted in applause. People stood from their tables, faces alive with emotion. Owen bowed awkwardly, unused to such a response. "That was transcendent," said a woman who had approached the stage. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her posture impeccable. "I'm Vera Novak, director of the Thornfield Institute of Music." Owen recognized the name immediately. Thornfield was one of the most prestigious music academies in the region. "Thank you," he managed. "That violin," Vera continued, gesturing to Elise. "It has extraordinary voice. And you play with remarkable sensitivity for someone trained primarily on cello. How did you know I'm a cellist?" A smile touched her lips. "Your fingering technique. But you connect with that violin in a way few musicians achieve with their instruments. It's as if you're having a conversation rather than simply playing." Owen carefully placed Elise back in her case. "She's still being restored. Madeline Rossi is working on her." "Madeline?" Vera's eyebrows rose. "She hasn't taken new commissions in years." She handed Owen a business card. The Thornfield Institute is hosting a special program next month, master classes culminating in a recital featuring rediscovered musical treasures. I believe you and your violin would be perfect additions. After Vera departed, Owen played 3 more pieces, alternating between cello and violin. Each time he picked up Elise, he felt more confident, more alive. The music flowed from somewhere deep within him, somewhere he thought had dried up long ago. As he packed up for the night, Juniper pressed an envelope into his hand. "Your payment, plus a little extra," she said. "And a standing invitation for Saturday nights. You brought something special here tonight, Owen." Walking home through the quiet streets, Elisa's case light in his hand, Owen felt a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced in years. Something was shifting, aligning, in the violin, in himself, in the universe around them. The path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, uncertainty felt like adventure rather than anxiety. Back in his apartment, he placed Elisa's case on the table and opened it, gazing at the violin's gleaming form in the dim light. "We did it," he whispered. "And this is just the beginning." In the stillness that followed, he could have sworn the violin strings vibrated slightly in response, a silent promise of music yet to come. "Hold it to the light, there, can you see it now?" Madeline's voice trembled with excitement as she held a magnifying glass over Elisa's interior. Owen leaned closer, squinting at the tiny, faded inscription she discovered weeks earlier. After countless hours of careful cleaning and research, the letters had become clear enough to decipher. A Guarneri fecit Cremoni anno 1742. Andrea Guarneri? Owen breathed, barely daring to hope. Madeline shook her head, her eyes sparkling. "Not Andrea. This signature and style suggests it's the work of his grandson, Bartolomeo Giuseppe Guarneri, known as Del Gesù. One of the greatest violin makers who ever lived." Owen's knees weakened, and he sank onto a nearby stool. "That's impossible. A Guarneri del Gesù in a pawn shop for $10? "Not as impossible as you might think," Madeline replied, carefully setting the violin in its case. "Wars, revolutions, economic hardships, many masterpieces have been lost, stolen, or forgotten. Instruments change hands, lose their provenance papers, get damaged and repaired by those who don't recognize their value." She gestured to Elise. "Someone knew enough to try to repair her once. Those older restoration attempts show some skill, but not enough to identify her." Owen ran his fingers through his hair, his mind racing. "If she's authentic, she could be worth millions," Madeline finished softly. "But authentication would require examination by multiple experts, documentation of provenance, and possibly even material analysis." A complicated mix of emotions washed over Owen. Part of him felt elated at the discovery, yet another part felt strangely protective of Elise, as if her newly revealed identity might somehow take her away from him. "What should we do?" he asked. Madeline studied him thoughtfully. "That depends entirely on what you want, Owen. This violin came to you for a reason. What happens next is your decision." Later that evening, Owen sat in his apartment staring at Vera Novak's business card. The Thornfield Institute audition was in 3 days, and he still hadn't given her an answer. The discovery of Elisa's potential heritage had only complicated matters. If Elise truly was a Guarneri del Gesù, she belonged in the hands of a master violinist, not a struggling cellist with performance anxiety and unpaid bills. Yet the thought of parting with her made his chest ache. In their short time together, the violin had reawakened something he thought he'd lost forever: his voice, his purpose. His phone buzzed with a text from Madeline: "Final adjustments complete. Come by tomorrow to pick her up. She's ready." Owen set down his phone and opened the email from his former employer at Westridge Academy. It was a tepid reference letter that barely masked the circumstances of his departure, how his increasing struggle with anxiety had led to missed classes and lackluster performances, culminating in his position being eliminated during budget cuts. He closed his laptop and picked up the composition he'd been working on, a piece that had flowed from him after learning about Elisa's potential pedigree. It told the story of an object of extraordinary beauty created by a master's hands, then lost to history, forgotten and damaged, only to be rediscovered and restored to its former glory. The parallels to his own life weren't lost on him. Once considered a prodigy, Owen had graduated from the conservatory with honors, his future seemingly secured. But a disastrous debut performance with the Philharmonic, when panic froze his fingers mid-concerto, had sent him into a spiral of self-doubt from which he'd never fully recovered. Until now. Until Elise. The next morning, Owen arrived at Madeline's workshop to find her putting the finishing touches on Elise. The violin gleamed under the workbench light, fully restored to her former glory. The cracks had been meticulously repaired, the varnish carefully matched to preserve her original color while highlighting the beautiful flame pattern of the maple. "She's magnificent," Owen whispered. Madeline nodded, satisfaction evident in her weathered face. The voice of an instrument comes from many elements working in harmony: the wood, the craftsmanship, the age, and most importantly, the hands that play it. She carefully placed Elise in his arms. "Play something for me." Owen positioned the violin under his chin, a movement that now felt as natural as breathing, and began to play. The sound that emerged was even richer than before, resonant with centuries of history yet vibrant with new life. When the final note faded, Madeline's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've restored hundreds of instruments in my lifetime," she said quietly, "but rarely have I witnessed such a perfect union between player and violin. She speaks through you, Owen. And you through her." As Owen left the workshop with Elise securely in her case, his phone rang. It was Vera Novak. "Mr. Phillips, I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind about the audition." Owen took a deep breath. "I'm sorry for the delay. There have been some developments regarding the violin." "Oh?" Her interest was piqued. "Madeline believes it might be." He hesitated, still struggling to believe it himself. "A Guarneri del Gesù." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. "If that's true," Vera finally said, "this changes everything. The Thornfield Institute would be very interested in featuring such an instrument in our upcoming program. But of course, we would need to verify." "I understand," Owen interrupted. "But before we discuss authentication, I need to know something. Are you interested in the violin, or the musician playing it?" Another pause. "Both, Mr. Phillips. A great instrument is only as impressive as the hands that give it voice." Her tone softened slightly. "Your performance at the cafe moved me. That doesn't happen often these days." As Owen hung up, a notification appeared on his screen, an email from Alexander Reeves, the conductor who had witnessed his disastrous debut 5 years ago. The subject line read simply, "Heard you're playing again." Owen stared at it, his thumb hovering over the delete button. Instead, he slipped the phone into his pocket. Whatever Reeves had to say could wait. Right now, he had an audition to prepare for, and a decision to make about Elisa's future, and his own. The Thornfield Institute's recital hall buzzed with anticipation. Carved wooden panels lined the walls, designed to create perfect acoustics in the intimate space. In the front row sat Vera Novak alongside 3 distinguished-looking individuals, experts flown in to examine Elise. Backstage, Owen paced in tight circles, Elisa's case clutched in his hands. His reflection in a nearby mirror revealed a man transformed. Gone was the disheveled music teacher in worn clothing. Instead, he wore a charcoal suit Madeline had insisted on having tailored for him. "An instrument of Elisa's caliber deserves appropriate presentation," she'd said firmly. "5 minutes, Mr. Phillips," a stagehand called. Owen nodded, his throat too dry for words. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of preparation, practicing until his fingers bled, then bandaging them and practicing more. He'd barely slept, running on adrenaline and the strange, powerful connection he felt with Elise. A soft knock at the door preceded Madeline's entrance. She carried herself with dignity despite her age, elegant in a vintage dress that hinted at her former life as a performer before she turned to instrument restoration. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though his pale face answered the question. "Terrified," Owen admitted. "What if I freeze out there? What if I can't do her justice?" Madeline took his trembling hands in her steady ones. "You won't be alone on that stage, Owen. You and Elise have found each other for a reason. Trust that." He managed a weak smile. "What happens after today? If they confirm she's authentic?" The question that had haunted him remained unspoken. Would he lose her? Before Madeline could answer, the stagehand reappeared. "It's time, Mr. Phillips." Walking onto the stage felt like moving through water, each step requiring conscious effort. The lights blinded him momentarily, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw the packed audience. In the third row sat Alexander Reeves, the conductor whose email Owen had finally read, not a message of criticism as he'd feared, but an expression of concern and an offer of support. Owen placed Elisa's case on the small table provided and opened it carefully. The violin seemed to glow under the stage lights, her restored body bearing the marks of her journey, like scars on a survivor, now badges of honor rather than shame. He lifted her, positioned her under his chin, and faced the audience. "This piece is called Restoration," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "It's the story of two broken things finding wholeness in each other." The first note trembled slightly as his bow connected with the string, but by the second measure, something extraordinary happened. The space between musician and instrument dissolved, and Owen felt himself surrender to the music. His fingers danced across the strings without conscious direction, producing sounds of such depth and emotion that several audience members visibly gasped. The composition told Elisa's story, the master craftsman's loving creation, centuries of music followed by abandonment, the years of silence and dust, the moment of discovery, and finally, rebirth. But intertwined with her tale was Owen's own, promise and failure, despair and redemption, the paralysis of fear and the liberation of reconnection. As he played the final movement, tears streamed down his face unashamedly. The music swelled to a crescendo that spoke not of endings but of beginnings, of possibilities unfurling like spring blossoms after a harsh winter. When the final note soared through the hall, it seemed to linger in the air for an eternity before silence descended. For one terrifying moment, no one moved. Then the audience rose as one, applause thundering through the space. Owen bowed, cradling Elise against his chest, feeling her vibrate slightly in response to the sound, or perhaps to his rapidly beating heart. Afterward, in a private room, the experts examined Elise with reverent hands while Owen watched anxiously. Their verdict was unanimous. Elise was indeed a Guarneri del Gesù, one of fewer than 200 in existence. "What do you intend to do now?" Vera asked him as they stood together, watching the experts document every detail of the violin. The institute would be prepared to make a substantial offer for her acquisition. Before Owen could respond, Alexander Reeves approached. "That was extraordinary, Phillips. I haven't heard playing with that emotional honesty in years." He handed Owen a card. "The Philharmonic is preparing a special series on instrumental masterpieces. We need both you and that violin." Later that evening, Owen sat with Madeline on her workshop porch, a bottle of champagne between them as twilight descended. "They've offered me a position at Thornfield," he told her. "Teaching composition and performing with their ensemble. And Reeves wants me for the Philharmonic series." Madeline smiled knowingly. "And what about the offers for Elise?" Owen ran his fingers over the violin's case. "I told them she's not for sale." He looked up at his mentor. "Is that crazy?" Turning down millions? What is money compared to finding your voice again? Madeline replied. Some instruments pass through many hands in their lifetime. Others find their perfect match and never leave. I believe Elise has found her home with you. We'll perform together, Owen said softly. Share her story with the world. And when the time comes, make sure she finds her way to someone who will love her as I do. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Owen opened Elise's case once more and lifted her into the night air. No audience watched as he played a simple melody, a lullaby his grandmother had once sung to him. The sweet notes rose toward the heavens, carrying with them a promise of stewardship, of honoring both the past and future of this remarkable instrument. In the gentle darkness, surrounded by cricket song and the scent of night-blooming jasmine, Owen finally understood the true meaning of restoration. It wasn't about erasing damage or returning to some pristine original state, it was about honoring scars while creating something new and beautiful from them. In saving Elise, he had indeed saved himself, but more importantly, together they had created a harmony greater than either could have achieved alone. As the final notes of the lullaby faded into the night, Owen felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new music to create, new audiences to move. But tonight, in this moment, the broken pieces had finally come together into something whole, something healed, a true second chance for them both.